Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I wanted to start off by introducing myself, and I am Heather Miller-Schwartz. I am a speech-language pathologist, and I've been working with kids with complex communication needs for 18 years. I've spent 15 of those years at Infinitec, and to know a little bit more about me, my passion is AAC. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And there are a variety of ways that you can use augmentative and alternative communication to support communication. And we will go into those as we go through this series together. And we'll talk more about the series on the next slide. But I wanted to let you know that this webinar has been brought to you by Infinitec and also by Illinois State Board of Education. One of my favorite quotes is by Pat Miranda, saying, "Breathing is the only prerequisite that is relevant to communication. Breathing equals life, and life equals communication, and it is just that simple." And what that means to me is that we all communicate. Even those children who are in your classrooms with the most complex needs are communicating in some ways. They may be with words, they might be with formal sign language or gestures, they may be with a look of an eye or a smile, or possibly some behaviors that you're seeing, but they are all communicating in some way. And you, as the paraprofessionals or teacher's aides, are the ones who spend hours upon hours with your students. You often know them the best and have the power to give your students a voice when they might not be able to find the words that they're trying to say. I'm excited to be able to spend the next 90 minutes with you and hopefully the next 5 Mondays so that we could dive deeper into communication, to learn about typical development today and also talk about a few evidence-based strategies that can help facilitate communication skills in all of your students. So the goals for our training today are, for one, to identify at least 3 reasons why people communicate. Identify 3 pragmatic, also known as social skills milestones. List 3 developmental language milestones. And name at least 3 strategies to promote language understanding in the classroom. The Common Core Standards are a set of shared goals and expectations for knowledge and skills students need to succeed in college, career, and life. The Common Core Standards for English language acquisition are very important when it comes to measuring progress. From kindergarten to 9th grade, I've outlined the standards in various ages. I believe I did kindergarten, maybe 3rd grade and in 5th grade or 9th grade maybe. Either way, all of them have some basic skills in common that students are able to participate in conversations, ask and answer questions, and express ideas in greater detail as you go along the continuum of age. And those are the basic expectations that we have for all of our students and our goals for all of our students. Often we try and tie our presentations to those standards since they are the building blocks for what we're doing in our schools. And so I wanted to include those standards on the next few slides for you to review. So on to a definition of terms. In our first section, we're going to define terms pertaining to communication. Our second section, we're going to talk a little bit about norms. There's a lot in writing. I don't want to go through each detail of the norms for you, but I wanted to give you that to refer back to at a later time, but also maybe a brief summary and some examples of some of those different age groups for you. And then the third section would be strategies that you could apply to use it to promote language development in the students that you're helping. Between these sections, I'll pause so that anyone who has questions can go ahead and type those in the message window or in that questions panel that Tim told you about. If you do type in that message pane and it is about the content of the webinar, we will have those natural breaks. So I won't stop at the time that you send it, but we promise that we'll try to get to all the questions as we go through. The next thing that I want to say is if we don't get to your question, I have my email address at the end of this presentation, and I welcome your feedback and I welcome your questions via email. That way we could communicate in that way, and if you need more details, we can schedule a phone conference and discuss in that way as well. So our first definition is communication. When put simply, communication is the act of transferring meaning. It's an interaction between two or more people to exchange information, news, ideas, and feelings. Communication is a process, and it allows us to transmit that meaning in a very dynamic way. Communication is always moving and changing. It's something that can be done in many, many ways. So why do we communicate? Janice Light did a study in 1997, and of her research, she suggested that there are 4 main reasons why we communicate. The first is to communicate our basic wants and needs. The second and third are ones that I probably do a lot more than the first. Communicating my wants and needs, that's something that I often can do myself. I can go get my food, I can go get my drink, I can go use the restroom if I need to, and a lot of our students are the same way. However, there are students who aren't able to complete those skills, and that's when we begin to focus more deeply on those wants and needs. However, it's in our basic human nature to want to transfer, exchange communication and ideas from one another. That's when we're at the lunch table and we're telling stories about what we did over the weekend or a funny thing that my kid did the other day. That also enables us to do the third, which is establish and maintain social closeness with one another. The last one that Light outlines is to exhibit social etiquette. Those rules that tell us exactly how to participate the right way, the correct way socially, so that we're successful. Saying hi when someone says hi to me, answering questions and asking questions as I walk through the halls, stopping to speak to someone. Those are all ways that we communicate for social etiquette. Recently, an additional reason was put to play, and that was that communicating with oneself. So I gave the example earlier about, okay, so I'm in my webinar, what do I need? I need to make sure that I have my phone next to me, my timer. Okay, are my closed captioning working? Okay, now I'm not saying all this out loud, but you better believe that it's going through my head constantly. And that's that social dialogue, that reminder system that I'm communicating with myself. To break it down either further, there have been a lot of studies that outline all the different communicative functions that students and adults do perform on a daily basis. I might greet, I might affirm and say, yes, that's what I want. I might deny or say, stop, cessation. I could refuse. I could say, I don't want. Negation is don't. I might request a lot of things. I might request that for information, request attention, request an object, request an action, request that something happen some more. All these different things, there's lots of stuff, and they all slot into those top 4 reasons that we said in the last slide. So why do we communicate? At the most basic level, when you look at all these, my kiddos may not share stories yet. Sharing stories, that might be a skill that they might develop a little later. They may want to, but they might not have developed the ability to ask to be changed or ask to have something to eat. So they might not be thinking about stories right now, or they might not be prioritizing that. What they say is our most basic functions of communication, those communicative functions that we see our students performing, not students, our children performing by the age of 1 year old, would be to refuse things that we don't want. So when I feed my baby a baby food that he doesn't like, he's going to refuse by keeping his mouth closed or spitting it out at me or turning away. To obtain things that I do want. So you see babies looking towards things or reaching towards things, looking for mom because he can't find her right now. Engaging in social interactions, there's a lot of that going on in those first months and years of life. And providing or seeking information. You see that especially when that first gesture starts to form of that finger point. What's that, Mom? What's that? What's that? Where you see that finger going and requesting all that information about the environment around them. How do we communicate? We said before that it's done in many ways, and we all use many different ways to communicate. Oftentimes, I'm going to communicate in the fastest and easiest way that I can at that time. For example, in the past week, when my kids were playing outside, if I'm not going outside in public ready, I might kind of peep my head out the window and wave to them, hey, come on back in. I might see my neighbor across the street and be mortified because I haven't showered yet, but I'll wave across the street to say hi to my neighbor because I can't get too close. My family and I, actually, they had, and the previous examples, were gesture, and even some speech when I was calling my kids in. My extended family and I used an app called House Party to connect yesterday because it was a holiday for us. And so we were using some nice technology on our phones so that we could connect on our holiday. I FaceTimed with my best friend a couple weeks ago, and I did my book club as a Zoom meeting. I posted on Facebook, I sent emails, I called people on the phone, I forced my child to write thank you notes for his birthday presents and ship them off in the mail. So I use many different types of communication on a daily basis. And now to break it down even further, we could say, yes, that is a form of multimodal communication, gesture, speech, and all the electrical forms that I used. Multimodal communication means all the different ways that I'm communicating on a daily basis. So when we're looking at nonverbal and non-language related communication, think of all the nonverbal ways that you communicate with people when you are face-to-face. I do use speech, and I do use a lot of gesture. However, I also see kiddos using a lot of body tone. I had a young lady that I was working with who had a traumatic brain injury, and she didn't have a lot of movement, but she would tell me she didn't like something because she would clench her jaws. And you could see it in her face, but that's what she had to work with. So her multimodal communication was her facial tension and her facial expression. In these pictures, you see this young man gesturing on the globe, pointing. We have this young lady using facial expression, a nice high five, raising your hand to talk and say, I've got something that I want to say. So everyone uses multimodal communication, but those students with complex communication needs often might use these without speech. So these non-speech forms of communication are also called pre-linguistic, or they happen before language. However, for some of our kids, this is what they have, and this is very important because this can tell you a lot about what they're trying to say. And you, as paraprofessionals, I bet you could go ahead and list for those kids, if you have kids that you work with that do not have verbal skills, aren't able to speak or use a formal language system, that you probably can list a lot of nonverbal ways that they communicate with you. There was a study that was done. I believe that the author was Sigafoos or Keen. I'll have to get that. If anybody wants this study, it's amazing. They did a study where they interviewed educators and staff in a classroom and asked the staff members to list all the different ways that their chosen student communicated. And those staff members rocked it. They knew every way that their student communicated. They could list it from A to Z, all the different ways. But then when you threw them in the middle of a classroom with all the different things going on, you have one student who's frustrated because he doesn't get an assignment, and you have another student who's uncomfortable and howling, and you have another student who just wants your attention and keeps coming up to you. There's a lot going on in the classrooms that you work, and therefore sometimes these more subtle ways of communication are missed. And that's why you are so important, because you are there and there are sometimes more than one para in the class, and together you can recognize these communication methods and either model more advanced forms, or you can at least just acknowledge, because sometimes just acknowledging what that student is trying to say can mean the world as far as lowering frustration levels. Let me give you an example. I have a student and he has a speech generating device, also known as an augmentative and alternative communication device. It's an iPad-based device with core words. So it has word-based vocabulary, and he builds words. He puts them together to make sentences, and he's got a very large vocabulary. He also speaks. And so he, to me, when I'm speaking with him, he really seems like a very advanced communicator. However, he has autism, and in the grand scheme of the classroom, he gets very excited, and he also gets anxious when he's not sure that he could have something he wants, and that gets in the way of his formulation of language. He was having a lot of behaviors, and it took us to have our team sit down and have somebody come in and observe him very closely to identify that he was giving us a lot of cues with what he wanted during those times just through his eye gaze. So my young man, we were in a music class, and he was staring at the drum, but not all the time. He would look at the drum and then look back at the teacher, and then look at his eyes just kept going back to the drum. And then out of nowhere, he blasts over towards the drum, knocks over everything in his path and everybody in his path so he could go to the drum. Now the teacher was baffled. Why did he just run away from my class? Well, he was telling us why, but we didn't see it. So that's when I, as a partner, might have been able to say, oh, I see you looking at the drum. There's something about that drum. Would you like to share? So now it's opening the door to help him to have a successful encounter. And so with our students, we're going to talk a lot about multimodal communication throughout this series and talk about how we could shape it in order to build on that so that we can make interactions more successful. So let's do an exercise on multimodal communication. I usually have I love to talk and have discussions with people. So I do urge you to please reach out to me if you do want to have a discussion about anything that I put on these slides today. But I do have a video, and there's this young lady who has a speech motor impairment, which makes it difficult for people to understand her when she speaks. I would like for you to jot down every way that you see her communicate. And then I'm going to discuss this in just a minute. She's 5 years old, and she has childhood apraxia of speech. How are you doing today, Rhiannon?
I'm good.
You're good? Are you going to tell us a story today?
Yeah.
Okay, you tell us a story.
Once upon a time, there was a unicorn named Nothing.
Name Nothing?
Yeah.
Your unicorn's name is Nothing. Okay. What happened to your unicorn?
She walked in here. She walked and walked. How she jumped behind a tree and she
She jumped way into a tree?
and she jumped like
Poor unicorn. What happened next?
she hurt her ankle on the ground.
Oh no.
She was okay.
Oh, that's good. She was okay.
So she is like bumped into a big mountain.
Oh, look at the camera. Yeah, there. She bumped into a big mountain?
Yeah.
What happened next? Poor unicorn Nothing. Over here. Look over here.
She climbed up the mountain. And she slipped off.
She slipped off the mountain.
And she was okay. And she went like, and
That was a great story. Thank you very much. Can you say bye?
goodbye.
There we go. Okay, this is
I need to listen to that again. Okay, so I love this video. I think she does such a nice job of supplementing her speech. I think that our young lady does such a nice job supplementing her speech. Okay, so she does a very nice job supplementing her speech in order to help us to understand what she's saying. It looks like it's a strategy that she's really formed over time to enable success, and I think it did help me to understand the things that she was saying. Some things that I saw her do to communicate: she used her speech. She used a nice big smile to talk about the tone of the story. She had a lot of movement. She indicated when exciting parts of the story were coming up by jumping up and down and moving around more excitedly. Her gestures, so she used natural gestures like shaking her head and nodding her head, but she also did some nice pantomime to help to tell the story with her fingers. She used eye gaze, so she was looking not only at her listener, but then when it came time for the unicorn to be on the big mountain, otherwise known as the couch, she kept looking at the unicorn because that's where the unicorn was at that time, and that's what she was directing her listener to look at because that was the star of her story.
She spoke faster when she was excited. She used different volumes and different types of tones in her voice. For example, at the end when she goes, the end, I don't know, because that helped me so much to understand that she was signaling that it was the end by that intonation pattern that people often use to signal the end. However, if I heard that in isolation, I'm not sure if I would have understood the end just by the speech that was coming out of her mouth. So she used so much, and I'm sure that if you were taking some nice notes, you have some that I had missed. But this was just a great example of multimodal communication in this student. Another definition is speech. Speech is one way that we communicate. And for humans who are hearing, that this is typically the most efficient way for people to communicate when they have the musculature that's in place for speech. It involves using your oral mechanism to produce a verbal production, and it takes over 100 muscles in order to communicate using speech. When you're talking about speech, and if you have a student that you're supporting in your classroom, your student might have an articulation disorder. Articulation means the way that you say your sounds. So those kids with an articulation disorder might be saying W for R, so wabbit instead of rabbit. It's the way that we use all of our articulators, or the parts of your mouth, tongue, lips, maybe your soft and hard palate on the top of your mouth, in order to create those sounds that come out of your mouth. Voice. Voice is how we move the air over the vocal cords to produce sound. If you have a student who has a voice disorder, that might sound differently for them than it does for others. Some kiddos have their voice going through the wrong place. There's a lot of muscles that are working to direct the air into your articulators. And so if the muscles up by your nose aren't working, then your speech might come out very hypernasal, where it sounds very nasal. You might have a voice that's raspy because of the way that you're forcing those vocal folds together with too much tension, or if there's something wrong with your vocal folds. With a lot of these speech disorders that we'll talk further about next time, often it's easy to miss them when they are present. So I don't notice somebody when I meet them and say, boy, they've got a very normal voice. But if their voice is abnormal, if they're very hoarse, or if they have patterns where air comes out faster or slower in bursts, I notice that. And so the same with fluency. Fluency is the rhythm of our speech and how people might repeat sounds when they're talking. I have done some repetitions as I've been speaking, or as I've misspoken. I also have interjected some things like or well, Those are all affecting my fluency and the rhythm of my speech. When people are observing me, if I say a lot of ums and wells, and if it becomes too much, people start to notice, and it can affect people's perceptions of you. It also can be very difficult to understand someone who is very disfluent. Someone who is disfluent can be doing something called stuttering, or sometimes it's called disfluency. And you may have kids that you work with who have some fluency differences. Further speech definitions are rhythm, loudness, speech, and pitch. And these are all things that we do with our voice in order to give more meaning to the things that we're saying. So the rhythm is the flow of connected speech. People who have normal rhythm will sound very natural. It has to do with how you pause and how you phrase things. People who have difficulties with rhythm may sound very robotic and very unnatural. Loudness, or actually speed, is next. Speed is how fast or slow we speak. I have a tendency to speak very quickly, and that is something that I really try to work very hard on when I'm speaking to audiences. Loudness, it's the amount of volume you use while speaking. I always chuckle when I speak on vocal volume, thinking about Jerry Seinfeld's low talker when there was that woman in his episode that spoke very quietly. I have some friends who are quiet speakers. And again, I don't notice when people have the normal vocal volume, but if someone is speaking too loudly or too quietly, that is something that I am alerted to. And lastly, pitch. We do a lot with pitch and intonation to help us to convey meaning to our listeners. For example, going up at the end of a sentence to signal a question, or speaking with force and with a direct, and being louder and being more monotone if we're giving a direction. And so there's ways that we can use our pitch and our intonation to give more meaning to what we're saying. Not only does this help with us to convey our message, but it could really affect people, especially individuals who are on the autism spectrum, who don't understand some of these subtle speech differences. So I've had kids on my caseload who don't recognize a different voice when I'm using a friendly voice versus a stern voice. Some of my students might not pick up on the intonation to know that I asked a question. And these things often have to be explicitly taught. And sometimes it's easy to feel that maybe that student isn't listening, but it could be something as small as an intonation difference that's making that student not understand those things that we're trying to say. So language. We communicate to connect. And while many people and animals and beings are able to connect through communication, like my cats communicate, not all things have language, and humans are the only ones with the unique ability to use symbols like words, signs, pictures, gestures to transfer specific meanings, and that sets us apart as communicators. A language is a system, and it is conventional, it has symbols, and there are definite rules to how things go together in a language. When I am communicating by gesturing towards my pop to say, I'd like that pop, just through a gesture, I might just point to it, and my kid will see me pointing to my pop, and I'm on the phone, I can't talk. I point to my pop, my kid, who's this angel, will just run over, grab the pop, and hand it to me. And I don't know when the last time that happened, but we'll just pretend. However, let's say that I say, can I have the pop, please? Now, the first time I was communicating, but I wasn't using language. The second time I was communicating and I was using language. There was definite rule to the way that I put that together. We can have communication without language, but we can't have language without communication. It's kind of, they kind of go hand in hand. So finally, we've got the AAC definition. The reason that I put America's Speech Language Hearing Association up here so big is that I didn't want to forget to introduce it to you. You'll see AAC all over this presentation in these little, these clickable links. And that's because AAC is the association that I belong to that really tells me how to do my job, and it gives me the definitions for a lot of things that I may have learned a long time ago, or I may not have learned about at all that pertains to speech and language. And so you'll hear me throwing around AAC says, and that's just that Association of Speech, Hearing, and Language Association. And so AAC's definition for language refers to the words we use and how we use them to share ideas and get what we want. So we have language form. Language has form. What that means is how we make words. For example, putting endings on words, putting prefixes on words, how certain letters go together and certain letters don't. That's the form. My son, when he was in first grade, never used vowels when he was inventively spelling. He would, like, if he was spelling form, it would be FRM. And I told him, it is a rule that you cannot have a word without a vowel. That's a rule. That's a form. Then we've got content. Content is language's meaning. It's very important that we have meanings in our language. So that means, what do these words mean? And that's content. And then use, how we put it all together and understand and create language in order to get our point across. So a language has all these three things: form, content, and use. Now, one more definition has to do with social skills. So I was telling a story earlier about my son when he was very young. He was 3, and I invited a friend over, and she was pregnant. And he looked at her and he's like, "What happened to you?" Like, he had not seen her that way. And I was like, "Ethan, stop." Like, I was appalled. Now, my son had great language, but his pragmatics and social skills weren't to the place that I wanted them to be at that moment. You can also think of somebody you might have had a conversation with in the past. For example, my neighbor. I went out to speak with him about the swim team, and maybe he was having a hard time staying on topic. He might start talking about his favorite TV show. Maybe he wasn't making eye contact with me. He didn't laugh at any of my jokes, and I was hysterical. And he kept talking and didn't pause to check if I had anything to say. And he actually, when I looked at my watch and said, "Wow, it's 5 o'clock, I gotta go make dinner," he just kept talking. Now, those sorts of things, those are alerting to me that, you know, he's able to speak. He knows the rules of the language. He knows the meaning of the language. But that use piece, that pragmatic use piece, doing it in the right conventional way, that's where his breakdown may be. And so that's that whole social language, social emotional, pragmatic piece. So we're going to pause here, and I'd like to know if there are any questions before we go on to really breeze past typical development.
Yeah, I have 4 questions here for you. How do you teach students on loudness? I'm thinking of a 2nd grader with an IEP for autism whose volume is generally louder than that would be considered necessary, especially when excited, anxious, trying to get someone's attention, those kinds of things.
I would love for you to email me that question for more information, but there's a lot of great information about teaching loudness, and a lot of times people teach loudness using visual cues. And so having a scale of different loudness levels, so maybe we have a level 1 scale or a level 3 scale, and level 5 is really loud, but doing a lot of explicit instruction as far as, okay, now we're going to practice our level 1 scale. Have a visual for level 1, and that's when we whisper. And then level 3, that's when we're in the classroom and we're talking about something with our friend. But level 5, that's when we're out on the playground and you have a visual for level 5, and then we practice level 5. So really breaking it down, having it taught explicitly, and then labeling those levels as your student is exhibiting those in the classroom. Oh, Johnny, that's a level 5 voice. Remember, a level 5 voice is da-da-da-da-da. We need a level 3 voice. Let's practice. So there's a lot of information on teaching voice, and I'd love to share it with you. But that's just a real brief overview of some things that I've tried.
I have another question that's very fitting for this time. If you're used to the students' nonverbal cues, how does that work with remote learning?
Great question. Okay, so remote learning, I guess I'm going to take the liberty of making some guesses about the way that you're providing your services. So I may be completely off mark here. But if you're doing remote learning and you're supporting a student through web-based instruction, if you're doing direct instruction with that student, and I almost always encourage for teletherapy to have another person in the room with that student so that they could help to identify when that student is doing some of those subtle gestural communication methods. I think that while every student could benefit from remote learning and from those sorts of instruction methods of having the web-based learning, I think that some students may be best served through a consultative approach where your parent or your communication partner next to the child might be providing the instruction while you help to coach that person. And that way they're there in the moment, but you're able to help to drive and direct the instruction from your end. I hope that answered your question. And if not, please email me and we can talk further about it.
do you have any suggestions for working with the transition students, 18 to 21-year-olds who are at home and do not have their AAC devices?
Yes, I know that that's happened a lot. I think that we weren't all expecting to be going home for this long. So if they don't have their AAC devices, I would first of all speak with your administrators and speak with your speech path or whomever is in charge of that in your district. Some general things as far as what you could do for any student would be to look and see if there are any paper-based supports that could help to support your student. So for example, let's say that your student is using an iPad with touch chat word power. That's a specific device, that's a specific vocabulary for those of you who are not familiar. If you go to their website, the family could print out a free book that looks just like it. And so I feel that low-tech support could be helpful for those students. And if you want to contact me and if you're looking for more information, almost every vendor has a low-tech partner. Low-tech means paper-based or something that you can't plug in. So if your student is using a high-tech or computerized system, there's almost always a low-tech or paper-based partner that I could direct you to. And that's another strategy that you could do. But I would always talk to the person who's in charge of that at your district to make sure that they're involved in whatever plan that you're moving forward with. So we're going to talk a little bit about typical language development. Now these are norms that were generated by the American Speech, Hearing, and Language Association. And so these are American norms. These are norms for kids who are developing with typical development. So that means kids who are speaking to communicate. These norms were not taken on gestural communicators, so not taken on students who use American Sign Language or Signed American English or any of the other signed languages. So I wanted to make sure that I gave you that information. Language learning takes time, and that's what I wanted to kind of show you in these next few slides. We're going to go over some of the things that you might see at these different ages, but we're not going to really dive very deep into it. I think what I hope that you could take away from this is grace. And I think that everybody's talking a lot about grace right now when it comes to giving grace to your educators who are doing this for the first time with teletherapy. Give grace to your families who are home with their students for the first time. Grace has been a big word in our environment lately. And I think that it hopefully is one that will continue to carry on in that our kiddos who are language learners or kiddos who are just starting off with an AAC system, we need to give them grace and pay attention to how long, as we look at these next slides, it takes kids to develop skills when they don't have any cognitive or motor. So for example, it takes a full year of listening to language before my young baby begins to say their first words. It takes between the age of 1 to the age of like 18 months to 2, so that's 6 months to a year before my child then starts to put 2 words together. Following one-step directions, my kid might be able to follow just some basic one-step directions at 2 years old. Go get your shoes, and usually it's within a routine. However, it takes a full year for them to say, okay, get your shoes and put them on, not say, for them to perform that. When you add a second layer to it, that's a whole year from going from one component in your direction to 2. I might at 2 years old be able to get your spoon, but then get your spoon and put it on the table. It takes a whole year to get between those 2 steps. And I'm saying this because I think that we get our kiddos in our classrooms and we want so much for them to succeed and for them to communicate in a conventional way that people could understand them. Oftentimes these kids may have augmentative and alternative communication. Let's say they begin to communicate with 1 word and we're so excited we're pushing them to 2. But we forget naturally developing kids take a whole year to get from 1 to 2 word utterances. And so giving them a little grace and understanding that we have to give lots of models and understand that it does take a lot of time. And so that's the basis for why we wanted to start off with overall communication. And for that, I wanted to give an example of my student, Joey. So Joey is on here somewhere. Okay, so my young man, he is not a speaker right now. He is not a fluent speaker, let's say. This young man, he has a lot of difficulty speaking, and so just putting consonant, vowel, consonant together into words like dog and mom are very difficult for him. And so we have a communication device, otherwise known as AAC, so augmentative and alternative communication. You might hear it called speech generating device. So he has this AAC device now, and he picks it up, and everyone was expecting for him just to take off with it. You know, when you think about people like Stephen Hawking, who he got his communication device and he was able to pick it up and speak with it and communicate with it immediately, right away. He understood that language, and he understood the connection between that symbolic language he was producing and his verbal language. However, my little Joey, he didn't understand that. And that's because for our young people, we're speaking to them with words, and then we expect them to make this translation from words all the way down to symbolic communication. That takes a lot of cognitive energy to get from my brain, where I know what you're telling me because I've been listening to language for a long time, but I've never produced this new language that's down here on my device. And so I use him as an example to remind us that language takes time. For second language learners who are completely immersed into a language environment, they say that a person who's learning English, who's brought to America and is sitting in an English speaking classroom, will take between 2 and 7 years to become proficient. And that's a student that does not have any cognitive or motor difficulties. So let's just briefly go over some of these language norms. This series of research studies suggests that between 8 and 12 months of age, we understand spoken words. We produce our first spoken word between 10 and 14 months of age. We begin pointing to direct the listener's attention right before my first spoken word, and then I'm able to follow a pointing gesture given by a caregiver by 9 to 14 months. By 3 months of age, I begin to recognize familiar voices. I may start cooing, crying, and smiling. And please feel free to look at this in greater detail on your handout. I'm going to breeze past these so we can get to strategies. By 4 to 6 months, my child is going to start looking towards sounds and starts to notice changes in my vocal tones. You're going to hear a lot more cooing, a lot more giggles and laughs, a lot more babbling. So consonant vowel babbling, like pa, pa. By 1 year, they'll start to respond to their name and understand more words and simple phrases and play games. They may begin to interact with others with sounds and gestures. They're going to start that vocal turn taking with their caregivers. They'll begin to wave. They're going to be initiating interactions, and then they're going to be able to say 1 or 2 words. The developmental milestones for social skills: by the age of 1, a child should respond to their own name, respond to no, act differently towards strangers than familiar partners, imitate the actions of others, and smile at others. By 2 years old, they're starting to identify body parts, follow simple directions. They might respond to simple questions like, "Where's Daddy?" or "What's that?" They will engage in reading, in book reading. They'll use a lot of new words. They'll ask simple questions. Things like, "Who's that? What's that?" They'll begin to put 2 words together at about 18 months. Their average attention span at the age of 2 is 4 to 6 minutes. Your child should start to help you to clean up. They'll recognize themselves in a mirror or a picture. They'll refer to themselves by name. They'll imitate adults. By 3, they're going to understand lots more language like go, stop, big, little. They'll be able to follow 2-part directions, like we were saying before: get the spoon, put it on the table; get your shoes, put them on. So related directions, often within a routine. Sorry, am I in the right place? Okay. has words for almost everything, talks about things that are not in the room, puts 3 words together to talk about things. By the age of 3, children start to defend their own position. And someone asked a question about that earlier in our presentation, and that means that if I have the toy and you're trying to take the toy away from me, I'm going to say that, no, this is mine. So defending what they think is right and wrong, defending that it's their turn, defending that they don't want to eat that piece of food you're trying to make them eat. They will use objects symbolically, and I think of my young child picking up my shoe and pretending like it's a phone, starting that pretend play, playing near other children, but not necessarily with them. By the age of 4, they'll begin to act out scenes while participating in dramatic play. They will start to play with other children for longer periods of time. And by the age of 4 years old, the average attention span is 8 to 12 minutes. By 5 years old, they're going to understand lots more words, follow longer directions, hear and understand most of what they hear in school, produce most speech sounds, know their letters and numbers, make some grammatical mistakes still. So Zach Gotts, that was the example they have here. Retell short stories or tell their own narratives, keeping their conversation going and talking in different ways depending on a listener place, knowing to code switch, knowing that it's okay to talk potty talk in front of my friends because they think that's funny, but grandma doesn't really like that. By the age of 5, a child should be able to play and interact with other children comfortably and have realistic dramatic play. Now, lots of social skills stuff here. So by the end of kindergarten, they're going to follow simple conversation, follow 1 to 2 step directions, answer most WH questions, retell stories. I'm sorry, this is language milestones. The next page is social skills. By the end of 1st grade, they'll be able to follow 3-step directions, novel directions. Remember most of what they hear, share ideas, stay on topic, answer yes, no, and WH questions, complex yes, no, and WH questions, give directions, and appropriately begin conversations. By the age of 6, a child is able to choose their own friends, play competitively in games, and their attention span is right around 18 minutes. By the age of 8 years old, the attention span is 16 to 24 minutes. And now you don't know how many times I can look back on my history as a speech language pathologist and feel so bad because I would think that my kids who were much younger than 8, and sometimes kids who really were showing me very age-appropriate skills, they were expected to sit there for 30 full minutes and listen to what I was trying to tell them. And that doesn't mean that they're not able to attend for 24 minutes, just not 24 minutes straight without a break, without moving. So there was somebody that wrote me after the last webinar. I was telling Tim and Sam when I came on that they said that to listen to the webinar, they had done laps around the gym and around their kitchen. And I thought that that was so fun and so appropriate to the conversation that we were having, and that in order to listen, those movement breaks and those are so important for all ages. And so she really demonstrated that. So please feel free to look at this in more detail, but pay special attention to this particular one because this is all about words and all about vocabulary. And I find it so fascinating how many words we have at 3, but also it took us 3 years to get there. So our kiddos who are first introduced to alternate communication like an AAC device, it took these kids 3 years to get to 1,000 words expressively. And that's with people speaking to them all day long in that language. Then we have a kiddo who's using an augmentative and alternative communication system, and we want them to jump up to 100 words right away. And these kids had 3 whole years to get there, and they didn't have any of the motor or cognitive challenges that some of our kids have. So I'm going to go ahead and take a breather so that people can ask questions about that. Please feel free to go and look in further detail, and then we'll and contact me with any questions. But Tim, are there any questions that you see that are pertinent right now?
Yeah, a couple that stood out. In a pre-K setting as a parapro, should you model or correct articulation or fluency errors?
I just had a question about that with English language learners, and there's a lot of research that is pretty sensitive when it comes to correcting errors with people who are making different sounds or pronouncing things incorrectly. So here is what the research says about norms for speech. Kids are developing speech sounds all the way up until the age of 8. By 8 years old, your kid should have all of their speech sounds. But there are certain sounds like THs that develop later. Like 8, I think, is the norm for THs. And so the best thing to do is, first of all, to contact your speech path and find out what her stance on that is. Secondly, is to model the correct pronunciation and emphasize the sound that you're trying to get them to produce. However, each speech path has their own method for that instruction. So I do encourage you to speak with your school speech pathologist about that.
Okay, how do you encourage students who prefer not to use their device? How do you encourage them to use their AAC device?
Well, first of all, finding out why. And I think that's a team approach. That's not something that you can do on your own. Speaking with the family, speaking with the other people in their environment about why. There are a lot of reasons why that could be occurring. And let me list a couple of the most common ones that I see. Number one, oftentimes those kids are in environments where not everybody is communicating using AAC. Sometimes they're the only AAC user in their class, and they don't want to be different. And so one of the best ways to do that is to get the AAC systems everywhere. And I don't mean to prescribe an iPad for a student who doesn't need it. I mean, put symbols up, put communication boards up, and start to use your own AAC device or your own communication board while you're speaking, so that it becomes more, and I'm doing air quotes right now because I don't like this word, it comes more normal. They see this as different maybe. Another thing could be that some kids, especially kids who are able to speak but might not be very clear in their speech, they consider themselves as speakers. That's their perception. Their perception is, I use my voice to speak, I don't use this. And so getting on the same page with your AAC user as far as what the view is of this system. And sometimes that compromise is, okay, you speak, and when I understand you, I'll just model back for you what you said so you know where it is. But if I understand you with your speech, then you speak. If I don't understand you with your speech, then we have to figure out how to help, and then that's when we might need to use your talker. And so figuring out a plan to know why, I think. And I could talk all day on this, but I won't. But please, if you want to talk more about this or about your particular student, please contact me, or also, again, ask your speech path about what her thoughts about that are.
Just one more question, and I'm not sure this is going to be quick, but how do you work with families that do not believe in AAC devices, or they believe that AAC devices are only for school and not for home?
There's so many different ways and so many different reasons that could be contributing to that view. And so without knowing the particular families, I'm going to tread lightly. And so with those cases, I think that you do what you can do at school. I think that a lot of times, if I feel strongly about a system and I feel like it's going to help, sending videos or having the parents see the successes that the student is having with the AAC system through either the data that you took or through the communication that you're able to capture in the classroom can sometimes be very powerful. So continuing to reinforce things in the classroom, and then what your product is and what your data is reflecting may change minds. But I also think, again, grace comes to mind. And I know that some of my parents have very intricate communication systems with their children, and it works very well for them. And so I think that honoring that, and maybe sometimes bringing it forth towards saying something along the lines of, what if you tried this just with one activity and see what happens? I'm not telling you to change your whole life at home, but maybe let's just do an experiment, you know, and you pick the activity, we'll do some coaching around that activity, and let's just see what happens. So we're not asking them to change everything because they've got a busy life and they've got a system that works, or that works for them at that moment where they are in their lives. But again, please contact me or your speech path. I'd love to speak further about that. Communication. So while this process is easy for some and maybe difficulties for others who have some differing abilities. So I want to draw your attention to the next slide, because next session we will be talking a little bit about some common speech and language disorders. When people have trouble with speech, language, or both, it's called a language or speech disorder, and they might have even more specific names like articulation disorder or fluency disorder. And basically, if we're going to separate these and define them further, a receptive language disorder means having trouble understanding what other people say. Or you might have an expressive language disorder, which means that you have problems sharing your thoughts and ideas and feelings. Now, these could be in isolation of one another. I might have a student who has a very complex body, but their mind is brilliant, and so they just solely have an expressive language disorder. Their receptive language is right on with their peers. On the other hand, I might have someone who has a very strong receptive language disorder but their expressive language appears relatively intact, and I'm envisioning somebody with autism who has a lot of speech. Now, because expressive language builds on what we understand, you usually will have an expressive language that follows if you're not understanding language. But some of those kiddos that I'm thinking of, they may be talking a lot, and to the outside observer, they might not recognize that there is a language disorder because they're able to speak so much. With those kids, their language understanding is more impaired than their expression. And so it could be any combination of this, and we will discuss this in more detail. But how do we facilitate more successful interactions with those students, but also with everybody in our classroom? And the first way is to recognize that to send information and to communicate, there must be two partners, a speaker and a listener. And a good partner can provide support in many ways. So I haven't showed any videos because I felt like we were running behind, or I think I showed one, but this is so funny. So I want to show you a video about how things can be impacted when you don't have a good communication partner. Okay, well, let me clarify. I think that man was a very amazing communication partner. He just didn't give up. However, that is just an example of how important both partners are in an interaction. And so the 7 communication partner strategies to support language understanding that we're going to discuss today is: number 1, to build rapport; number 2, to simplify language; number 3, allow processing time; number 4, supplement your language; number 5, be a good language model; number 6, offer praise; and number 7, presume competence. So our first one is to build rapport. By definition, rapport is a relationship marked by mutual understanding and trust. Rapport building isn't something that we do once and then drop, but it's something that continues to grow. And as our relationships grow, your student begins to trust you, and you begin to understand more about what their needs and wants are, because you're building that relationship and you understand them better and they understand you better. And there's that desire to be with you and to communicate with you. So when building rapport, speak directly to your student and don't talk to them as if they are beneath you. Take the time to learn about their interests and ask about them. Wait for responses from them. Sometimes it may take a bit for our students to formulate responses, and so offering them that time will gain that trust. Kiddos learn very quickly, especially a lot of our AAC users will learn who's going to wait for them and who won't. And for some of our AAC users, it takes a lot more energy to communicate than it is for someone who's using verbal language. And so I'm not going to put forth the energy for someone who's not going to wait for me. And so being that partner who is going to be someone that I could trust to wait and wait me out and listen to what I have to say, that's going to be a very, very big helper in our relationships and in our language building. Treating your students as a full communication partner, and this can be a tricky balance, because you need to talk to them as if they are adults, but still remember they're children. Talking with them like an adult doesn't mean that you're going to use adult vocabulary and really long sentences or tell inappropriate jokes or use information they don't understand, but it means that I'm going to respect them as a full communication partner. I'm going to take turns with them, I'll use eye contact, and I'm going to value the things that they say. As for younger children and for our kids with some of those more expressive language disorders, I might not understand everything that he or she has to say. A great tip for these students is to tell them what you do understand. So you hear a student and it's very apparent that I understood one word. So I'll tell them that word. It sounds like you said Minecraft. I know you're telling me about Minecraft. Tell me more about Minecraft. Creeper. A Minecraft and creeper. That's what I understand. Maybe you could act it out. And so with that, what you can do is start to build a script. You might ask WH questions. You might ask them to act it out. You might ask them to tell you who they were with. Tell me more about what this thing does. Through all these questions that you're having them answer, number one, they know you're invested in them and they want to get their point across to you, and they know that you're going to stand there and go through the time to help them to get their point across. But number two, you're building a script for them so that when they're with someone who might not wait as long, they have this bank of ideas for how to describe what they're trying to tell you. They'll remember that with you, you went ahead and you asked them what color it was. So now they might start bringing into color when they're describing something when there was a communication breakdown. So I played Minecraft with creeper. It's green, it blows up, and it makes me die in Minecraft. So now they've got all these tools through your questions over time that can help them to be successful in their next interactions. Number two is to simplify your language. So the way we speak to our students can impact their success. If we're speaking too quickly or using too many words, it can be too difficult for our kiddos to understand. So the best thing that we can do is to speak in shorter sentences, emphasizing the key words of what we want them to take away. Use intonation and slower speech to emphasize what's important. Don't use slang and puns and sarcasm. First of all, these skills don't come in until well into elementary school for kids who are in the general ed environment. And so then you add into that those students who might have be on the autism spectrum, and those sorts of puns and slangs are very difficult to understand and may be taken very literally and impact understanding. Also, when you're simplifying your language, break down your directions into steps. And here I just did one direction at a time and I paused. However, maybe your student could understand two step directions. So maybe I'll give them those directions in 2 steps and then pause and let them continue in that way. Number 3, allow time to process language. So processing speed is the pace at which a person can take in information, make sense of it, and begin to respond to it. These times vary for everyone and can be impacted by language level, hunger, fatigue, the amount of sleep they got last night, the comfort that they're in, and background noise is a big one. And if you think about it, if you add in kids who may have some motor impairments, that can take even longer. So I may understand what you asked of me. However, now I have to take the energy to either formulate the word that I want to say when that's difficult for me, or produce the motor movement of moving my hand towards my AAC system, or maybe my switch, or anything that I'm using, in order to produce an answer to your question. There's a lot of processes going on and a lot of cognitive effort that goes on behind the scenes that we're not necessarily seeing outwardly. And so always allowing more processing time is a great rule of thumb. And so I usually wait at least 10 seconds when I'm giving somebody a direction or asking a question. There were a lot of questions about this last time in our last session, and I think a couple of them were, well, what if the student is obviously not listening? You know, and I think you really, for example, one example that was given is, I tell my student, get the cookie, and he runs away. Well, I'm not going to count to 10 in that circumstance. I'm going to get him back and redirect him. But we really know our students, and talking to your team and identifying what are your cues to whether there is comprehension that's occurring and whether they are not comprehending and they're off to another thought. They're not even thinking about it anymore. Those are all things that you'll learn over time. But just in general, waiting to re-ask the same question is a great rule of thumb. And one analogy that I've heard over and over again is the flushing toilet. So when I flush the toilet in the bathroom, if I flush again right away, then it kind of breaks up the whole cycle and my flush never worked. If you give somebody a direction and they're processing in their brain and then you speak too soon, all the processing that they had done up to that point could completely be washed out because you just interrupted it and they were on their way there, and then we now have to start all over. And so it might actually take your student longer to comprehend if you interrupt too quickly. So leaving lots of processing time. Matt Bod, I heard him speak once, and he's from Niles Township. He had mentioned to sing a song in your head, and he sings the Mumford & Sons I Will Wait for You song, which I thought was so clever. So singing a song in your head can help. I oftentimes will count to 10. I try not to be too obvious about this because I don't want to distract the student, but if I'm working in a group, or if I'm doing group therapy, or if I'm doing some coaching, I'll often say 1 at first and like kind of nod my head to cue everybody around me that, oh, we are waiting. We're processing, we're letting him process, and we're going to count to 10 in our head before we redirect or we give that question or statement to our student or direction again. So number 4, supplement our language. So this research study that you'll see, it's in the reference list. There was a study that was done at the university level, and it discussed the impact of using different types of instruction in order to instruct students on college level material. So they were talking about different learning methods, and we're talking about learning methods such as seeing to learn. So being able to read, being able to look at slideshows, being able to hear the directions, being able to do. If I'm learning about a concept, being able to build something that has to do with that concept. A lot of times kinesthetic learning can take place where you're doing a movement, like the Jolly Phonics is something that comes to mind. So bringing in different methods and modes when you are teaching is very effective, and it was shown also in this college study. And so what they've done is they've done research studies where they have had somebody tell a story without any gesture, and then have that same person tell the story with gesture and see what level of understanding took place. And over again, what they found is that for everyone, gestures help us to understand. And so gestures like to represent the actions that are taking place, or even those facial expressions that could help to supplement the mood of the story. So if we supplement our verbal communication with gestures, body tone, and facial expression, the chances of understanding improves. There's another study that I referenced by Hofstadter. She did a meta-analysis of 38 different studies that looked at gesture and communication, and overwhelmingly supported this. But if you are like me and you like more information, that's a place you could go. Another way to supplement your language is to provide visual supports. You may have these in your classroom. You might have visual schedules. You might have recipe cards like the one in front of us. You might have those cards that tell the student to be quiet with just a visual cue of that board maker symbol, of the shh symbol. Writing out lists for kids, typed or picture supports. These can all help because language goes away, but these pictures stay here. And so I use visual supports all the time in my calendars and in my phone with all the reminders. This could definitely help for language understanding, as kids could refer back to it at a later time. And also to supplement language with AAC modeling. So if you do have an AAC communicator, augmentative and alternative communication device such as this one, that you could model the words on the device as you're speaking. That's a method that is called either partner augmented input or aided language stimulation. There are some other names for it as well, but we will be talking in detail about that, I believe, in the 5th webinar. Number 5, be a good language model. Now, being a good role model is always important, but being a good language model can encourage good grammar, higher vocabulary, and skills such as turn taking and respectful tone of voice. All of these things will be mirrored, especially if you have that rapport that you've built with the student. Students emulate those people that they respect. And so if I speak to people with respect, and that student respects me, they may start to speak more like me. And so being a good language model in your classroom can be very helpful so that we can help to encourage language and speech skills for our students. Number 6, offering praise. So we've heard of offering praise when we talk about behavior. And a great example of this is a quote by Jennifer Biorum on her website. She's a speech language pathologist, but she talks about behavior and says what you focus on, you'll often get more of. And that's where some behaviorists really encourage ignoring those really maladaptive behaviors, because if you pay attention to it, sometimes you might get more of it. Similarly, if you're talking about communication, if you offer feedback to your students about what they're doing right with the way that they're using their speech and language, that can help. So being very specific, talking about things like, wow, I love how you used that word, or I heard you use your sound. Those sorts of things with those specific praise can be very helpful, especially if it's related to the specific task or behavior, if it's provided immediately, if it's initiated by me and not the student. For example, when a student comes up and I say, good job, Johnny, and then Rebecca comes up and says, what about me? Even if I tell Rebecca, yeah, you did good too, it doesn't mean as much as it did to Johnny because I initiated it. That it's free from pretense and exaggeration. So to really go overboard and be like, oh my gosh, the way you lifted your finger was amazing, when the kid could lift his finger very easily, it's exaggerated and they see right through it. Offering more praise during the acquisition of a skill. So if they're just learning a grammatical morpheme, or if they're just learning a word and you see it used more, reinforce more at the beginning, but then taper off and start to look for other things to pay close attention to as they continue to show that skill. And then also not using comparison. Wow, you did better than he did on that. That's not an effective way to praise. And lastly, number 7 is to presume competence. We want to believe in every person's abilities. We don't want to talk about our kiddos and their challenges and their difficulties in front of other staff members. Even if you don't think your student understands what you're saying at that time, I still make it a practice not to talk about my students, no matter what cognitive level the psychologist has told me they are. I don't speak negatively about them in front of them because you just don't know what they do and don't understand. And I would hate for me to say something that would then have them set their bar there when they could be setting it higher. So students live up to those expectations that we set for them. You are some of the most important people in your students' lives. You're with them all the time. They respect you and they want to get to those levels that you set for them. Know that it's very important that you as staff will believe that they're capable, and when given the opportunity, it's very possible that they could rise to that expectation. This is the concluding slide, and then we'll open it up for questions. But all people have the right to communicate, and every interaction that you have holds an opportunity to promote a successful communication attempt and result. Because what you do counts, and what you think is very important, and how you respond to your students will matter. And I really thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to working with you more. And now, if there's any questions that we could hit in these next just couple minutes, let's do it. Otherwise, please email me. I'm always looking at my email.
All right. Yeah, we got a couple questions here. Do you find a difference between students using a device versus PECs as far as when or if they begin to speak?
What do the research studies show? I have not seen, when you're talking PECs, you're talking about, like, are you talking about, I'm not sure, Tim, are they talking about comparing picture exchange communication system or with AAC, or just in general, if you introduce AAC in general, will it affect how soon they acquire speech?
I think it was the difference between the two, between a speech generating device and the PECS system.
Okay, so for those of you who are on the call who aren't familiar with this PECS system, PECS is picture exchange communication system. That means that it's a very systematic way of teaching, requesting mostly to kids, and labeling, where a kid will hand me a picture or a photograph of, let's say, a piece of candy. When I get that piece of candy picture, I will give him that. And again, there's much more to it, but it's a low tech, it's a paper-based system. And I'll be honest with the person who asked the question, it depends on who your researcher is. I think that there are some research studies that have shown a very, very high impact with speech in relation to PECs that have been done by people who promote PECs. I have not seen any research studies that compare PECs with a communication device specifically as far as speech. All that I know is that overwhelmingly, using communication, using augmentative communication in any form whatsoever, whether it be PECs or whether it be a speech generating device or something in between, does promote often more speech development in kids. It will, and it does not hinder. In general, just using it will help speech. But I don't know any studies that really delineate between the two. But I'll look, and if I do have that, I will take down your name and send that to you.
How much modeling of AAC device is too much? When should you step back and wait?
Oh, good question. So I think that's two different questions. I never think that too much modeling is too much. I always model. However, as a part of modeling, especially if you've gone to the S'mores training by Jill Center and Matt Bod, and if you're looking for that training, let me know and I can send it to you. Pausing is all a part of the process. So you model and you pause. You model and you pause. And there's a lot more to it than that, but I think that it's kind of, they're not separate from one another. It's all the same. Just like when I'm speaking to my child who's learning language through speech, that I automatically embed pauses within. So I don't think that any modeling is too much. But if you're wondering when to pause, I think that, yes, pausing is very important.
This one has to deal with ELL. How does ELL and ELS affect this, as well as with the speech disorder? How can you tell the difference if it's an ELL issue or a speech issue or a processing issue?
Usually what they do is that they have therapists who are native speakers come and evaluate those students in their native language. And if the language impairment occurs within their native language, that's usually one of the components that would be able to delineate between an ELL issue alone or an ELL and a language impairment.
And then we have time for about one last one. Even if we do understand the student, should we still encourage the use of the device so that they can get used to it in someplace with maybe unfamiliar listeners?
I think that the best rule of thumb for that is that if you do understand that student, to model back on their system and not make them say it twice, because in their eyes, they've already said it once. And Kathleen posted a great example of this. So let's say that when I'm walking through the hall and I see you, I say hi to you and you say hello back. And I say, oh, good, you said hello. Now spell it for me. You'd be like, what? Every time you'd see me, if I made you say hello and then spell hello, you would avoid me like the plague. And so we don't want the kids to view their communication device as work. We want them to view it as a tool. And so if I understand them, I'm going to model back what they say using their AAC device so that they see where it is. I do often, if they're not looking, I might encourage that they look at the device while I'm modeling, but I don't make them say it again. If it's something that you're modeling all the time and they're seeing a lot of modeling going on, oftentimes it will naturally just occur that they'll start to use the system because it's always being used by others.
One last question before we go. If you're using visuals, is there a point where there's too many visuals? The person who asked this said that she's overwhelmed by how many visuals are on a page, and so she thinks that the students might be also.
Okay, well, and I think that it could be very well dependent on the student and field cuts and their vision and what they are able to see. And so if you have a student with a vision impairment or a cortical visual impairment, those are components that you might want to consider and to talk with your team about and see. However, I think that there are ways to isolate those specific visuals so that there's less in the field. You could put up things around it so that you're just focusing on one and there could be barriers to kind of let out the rest. So to answer your question, I think that it's very kid dependent. And I think if there is a visual issue, to bring it up to your team. I think that visuals can be very helpful, and I wouldn't want to get rid of them, especially if there's one that is really working for a student just because there was a lot more in the environment. I'd figure out a way to isolate it so that we could focus on one at a time maybe. But that's something, if you're concerned, that definitely you should bring up to your team.
All right, well, we are out of time. I want to thank all of you for joining us. There are still some questions that we did not get to. Please feel free to email Heather. Her email is on the screen there. I just, again, wanted to thank all of you for taking your time out of this afternoon for joining us. And thank you, Heather, as always. A lot of good information, and I hope that you all learned something today. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Tim. Take care.